Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Greg Jennett with you this Tuesday from our Parliament House studios here on Ngunnawal country.
And I'm Fran Kelly in Sydney on the land of the Gadigal people.
Great to see you back in more familiar surroundings after you've covered a bit of ground yourself in recent days. Fran?
Yes, Greg. Great to be back home. Day 30, Greg, that's where we're at, and it's brought a focus today on big-ticket infrastructure promises in the nation's two largest cities. From Labor, there was a $2.2 billion promise to team up with the Andrews Labor government in Victoria on a regional rail loop arcing across Melbourne.
Yeah, and from the Coalition, Fran, Scott Morrison stood alongside the Liberal Premier in New South Wales to pledge an upgrade to a major bridge in the currently Liberal-held seat of Bennelong, all the while arguing that driving a hard bargain with money-hungry premiers is a skill that he's mastered and that somehow Anthony Albanese has not.
There's an idea. I remember when we did Springvale.
Significant increase in population now in Sydney. Yep.
Good on you.
We've got all the spokes, but we don't have the wheel to connect all those different train lines.
Labor will always support nation-building projects.
Federal taxpayers will pay for Anthony Albanese's weakness.
No more getting stuck.
How good's that?
So you're at Blacktown, are you? Is that right?
All this stuff is quite amazing.
Here we go. There we go.
$2.2 billion is a very significant commitment. We would always like more.
He'll be happy to pay for the failures of state Labor governments with federal taxpayers' money.
This is the thing about the Federal Liberal Party. They say lots of things and they do very little.
Nation-building projects compared with a coalition that just get out the colour-coded maps.
You've described it as a kangaroo court. Are you a buffoon?
This project more than stacks up. It's not a cost, it's an investment.
If I'd have gone and knocked on people's doors down there in the Sutherland Shire and I said, if you let Kevin Rudd, 800 boats will turn up with 50,000 people on them. They will put in place policies that will set fire to roofs. If I had said that to people, they would have locked me up.
Urban public transport has to be an absolute priority.
That all happened when people thought there was a riskless change to a Labor government.
All right, complete with babies. We got a hint there that, once again, Fran, wage increases are well and truly back as a point of difference in this campaign. So the Fair Work Commission is currently gathering evidence and submissions on the minimum wage case, which would affect around 3 million workers in this country. Labor's made a point of arguing for wage increases, and Anthony Albanese, Fran's now tied himself to a specific amount. So on the latest official measure, inflation's running just over 5% for CPI, and that's the figure the Labor leader's backing as appropriate now for this minimum wage increase. But would that be the official position of an Albanese government if one was to form? Is that clear, Fran, in a couple of weeks from now?
Well, it's not clear, and it all depends, of course, if we have an Albanese government, but practice in government has been not to nominate an actual figure in a government submission. That's not actually where Anthony Albanese landed today, Greg. He started out on ABC Radio this morning refusing to endorse the ACTU bid for a 5.5% pay rise, but in exchanges with reporters later in the morning, he seems to have gone further than his original position, which is that minimum wage rises should keep up with the cost of living. People shouldn't go backwards, actually. And he ended up backing a pay rise in line with inflation, which of course is currently 5.1%. Now, in government, I doubt Labor would be wanting to put an exact number before the Commission, but Greg, Anthony Albanese has set Labor up for some pressure on the front if they don't. And of course, matching inflation at 5.1% is only really just below the ACTU demand.
I believe the minimum wage should at least keep up with the cost of living. I was asked this morning about the ACTU claim. The ACTU claim is the ACTU's. Labor will put forward, in government we would put forward a separate submission based upon Labor's claim. But we think no one should go... We think no one should go backwards. People should be at least keeping up with the cost of living.
You said you don't want people to go backwards. Does that mean you would support a wage hike of at least 5.1% just to keep up with inflation?
Absolutely.
And secondly, do you have any concerns about...
Yeah, absolutely was the answer there in among the throng of journalists. We'll come back to the issue of wages. I think both of us have got some interviews coming up on that, Fran. But why don't we change tack sharply now? The Liberal candidate for the seat of Warringah has been seldom seen or heard so far in this campaign, and that's largely deliberately by design. But when Catherine Deves, does speak to the media, Fran, this captain's pick of a candidate seems to have an enormous capacity to overrun the planned campaign themes of the day. So we found ourselves today, after an appearance on Sky News yesterday in which she revisited old messages about transgender adolescents, Catherine Deves diverted the Prime Minister's daily media conference into what became really a lengthy discussion on gender reassignment surgery. Not even remotely, Fran, about the bridges, roads and infrastructure that Scott Morrison wanted to talk about.
That's right. I mean, it happens on campaigns, and it happened today. The Prime Minister said again he didn't support the language of Catherine Deves, which describes gender reassignment surgery as mutilation. But he went on to say that the gender reversal surgery for young adolescents is a significant issue that parents are concerned about. Now, the problem with that, Greg, is in this country, gender reassignment surgery is not available for young adolescents. That's a fact the Prime Minister, under questioning, later had to acknowledge. So the question is, did he set it up as a straw man? Was he confused and really talking about puberty blockers, which can be prescribed for young people considering gender reassignment? It's unclear. But it certainly, as you said, derailed his other key messages for the day. But perhaps he's not unhappy about that.
What we're talking about here is gender reversal surgery for young adolescents. And we can't pretend this is not a very significant, serious issue. It is. It's complicated. And for us to pretend that it's a minor procedure, it's not. It is extremely significant, and it changes that young adolescent child's life forever. And so I think it's really important that we're very sensitive about those issues. I think it's very important we're sensitive about these issues. Very important.
Minors can't undergo that surgery. In Australia, only people aged 18 and over, according to your own healthdirect.gov.au website, can undergo gender reassignment surgery. It can't happen to minors in Australia.
Even at any other stage, this is serious change. It is irreversible change.
Prime Minister, do you agree with her comments?
Claire.
Do you define it as surgical mutilation?
That's not a phrase that I would use, and I'm sure it's not a phrase that any Prime Minister would use. I'm just simply saying that, this is a significant surgical procedure that completely changes someone's life, and it should never be entered into lightly, and it should never be entered into without a full appreciation of the irreversible changes that are at
Prime Minister, Catherine Deves has said that it is the correct terminology to refer to that procedure as surgically mutilated and sterilised. If you stand by her, you must stand by her definition of that procedure. Will you engage with the fact as well that there are no adolescents that can have this surgery? You are saying you have implied,
I'm not a surgeon.
Prime Minister, you have implied that young people 18 and over enter into a fundamentally life-changing surgery lightly. You said it's not something to be taken into lightly. That implies.
Well, it isn't something. Yeah,
but you're implying that people are going into
that at all, Claire. You're implying that. I'm not implying that. I'm
stand by the language, and if you don't, how do you stand by her apology?
I wouldn't use that language. I wouldn't use that
Prime
language.
Minister, have you spoken to her about the language? Have you spoken
I haven't
to
had the
Catherine
opportunity
Deves?
to speak to her about it.
What do you think of Claire's comment?
Sorry?
You can't speak to her about what she's been saying?
I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to talk.
What is the correct terminology?
I'm not a surgeon, and so I will rely on the Chief Medical Officer to use the appropriate. Well, I'm not the Chief Medical Officer.
All right, let's see where that one takes us. Not that Scott Morrison is proposing to divulge whatever it is he might end up discussing with Catherine Deves. Let's return to wages now, though. Now that inflation is high and rising, the union movement has upgraded its bid with the Fair Work Commission for a pay rise in the national minimum wage case. The minimum wage is at $20.33 an hour at present and would rise to $21.45 if the union's bid for a 5.5% increase was granted. Sally McManus is ACTU Secretary. We spoke to her a little earlier. Sally McManus, great to have you back on Afternoon Briefing. Inflation is not yet running at 5.5%. It may yet get there. It may not stay there either. So why seek to lock in a pay increase of that size for a full year?
Well, actually, the Reserve Bank is predicting inflation to be 5.9% by December, and the annual wage review increase kicks in on the 1st of July. So we know that inflation is going up, and even they, with their predictions that have been undercooked so far, are saying it's going to reach nearly 6% by Christmas. So our claim of 5.5% we think is incredibly reasonable, given that. We also think it's absolutely what workers need to keep up with the cost of living.
But aren't the Reserve Bank also expecting it to settle back down? Sure, it peaks up at 5.9%, but they've got it back in the low fours by the middle of next year. So it's not a sustained problem in their view, is it?
Well, if you look at the 1st of July this year, and already it's going to be above 5, and then it goes to, and this is just on the Reserve Bank's figures, then you go to December, it's 5.9%. Then they think by the time we get to the 30th of June, it might be 4.3. Well, I would say 5.5% is very reasonable. Like, first of all, it's the issue of people's wages not going backwards, and this would be a disaster. Already people are completely crunched with basics, rents, groceries, petrol. And who are we talking about? We're talking about 1 in 4 workers. It's the cleaners, it's the aged care workers, the ones that kept everyone going and risked themselves during the pandemic. And then what are we saying? That they should go backwards? They should go backwards even further. We should be supporting these workers getting that pay increase. And on top of that, productivity has gone up 1% on average over the last 10 years as well. So, you know, for workers to even see like their contribution to the country's wealth, it'd have to be another 1% on top of that. And we think that, you know, our claim of 5.5 is very reasonable.
Just on that latter point, the number of workers affected, as I understand it, it's not just those on the minimum wage national case, but the benefit of any increase would flow through to many others as well. What do you say that total number is?
Well, it's 1 in 4 workers, so we're talking over 2 million workers, so it's a lot of people. They're people on award wages, so they're minimum wages. In addition to that, there's some people that have their agreements tied to what happens in the annual wage review, and that's a harder number to calculate. But the fact that we've got 1 in 4 workers depending on this decision means it's the big game changer in terms of doing something about wages. It's the one thing that can make an immediate difference to get wages going. Obviously, if the minimum wage goes up and 1 in 4 workers goes up, that lifts the floor. That helps everyone else as well. Would
your case have been strengthened if the ALP, through Anthony Albanese, had directly matched and supported your 5.5% benchmark? He appears to be capping out at about 5.1 at the moment.
Well, I'll say this. Labor is saying that they support wage increases that keep up with the cost of living. Scott Morrison, in his submission to the Fair Work Commission, over 100 pages, not one single word saying that people should keep up with the cost of living. Instead, there's a whole section dedicated to the importance of low-paid work. So, you know, that submission is basically, you know, advocating for low wage increase. We've got that on one hand. On the other hand, we've got a political party who's saying that they support cost of living increases, and we welcome that.
In view of the fact we are in the middle of an election, or in fact the final phases of one, might you have jumped the gun in upping this bid as you have now? Why not wait until the result of the election is called, and then you could, for argument's sake, be talking to someone like Anthony Albanese around a cohesive figure?
Unfortunately, we don't control the timing of when we get to do these things. The Fair Work Commission does, and our submissions in reply were due, and so they were due actually today. So we had no choice in terms of the timing of that. You've got to comply with what the independent umpire's timetable is, not what an election timetable is.
It is possible, though, for the Commission to come up with interim decisions and not lock in for a whole year, though?
Not really. I mean, business needs certainty too. The increases have got to start from the 1st of July. So there is a final hearing on the 18th, so that's just before the election. But that's the end of all the hearings. So after, unfortunately, it's all after the election that they'll be deliberating. We as a union movement, got to do everything we can now to try and argue for people's wages not to go backwards.
You're obviously advocating this as forcefully as you can at this stage of the process with Fair Work Commission, but what if it wasn't accepted in full? What consequences would flow industrially from unions?
Well, if the Fair Work Commission, and obviously they'll make their own decision, but any increase less than 5.1% is a real wage cut. And already we're on track for working people in the first 6 months of this year, average worker to go backwards $2,000. Last year it was $800. Now this is a circumstance where corporate profits are up 13%. Some people have done very well in this pandemic. And what Scott Morrison is telling, low-paid workers, well, actually most workers, is that they should use this magic buffer that they've saved up during the pandemic to cope with the fact that their groceries and their rent are going up. Well, I don't know what world he's living in, because most people do not have a whole lot of savings. They've run it all down. They also ran down all their leave. People are, anyone who does not understand what people are facing now when they go to the supermarket or when they have to pay their rent or their petrol is not living in the real world. And so there could not be a more important wage decision than this one at the moment. Sure,
I know it's going to be very closely watched, but just on its affordability to business, it's one thing to quote corporate profits. They are going up, but it couldn't equally be said that every business could afford, in this inflationary environment, a 5.5% wage bill increase, could they?
Well, I'll say this. Big business, corporate profits gone up by 13%. Let's talk about local businesses and small businesses. You know where they get their money from? They get their money from the people in their community, and 1 in 4 of those will benefit from this wage increase. So their customers, if their customers have less discretionary money to spend, which they will if their real wages go backwards, that's less money to them. So what comes around goes around here. When low-paid workers get pay increases, they spend it all. They're not stashing it away in a tax haven in the Cayman Islands. They're spending it. They're not paying off their second mortgages or their third mortgages. It could be the worst thing we do for the economy to have the actual people driving it, which is the consumer, which is working people, having less money to spend. The people who will be also affected are those small businesses.
Let's see where the Commission process takes us. In the meantime, Sally McManus, thanks for joining us again on Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks, Greg.
And we just heard there ACTU Secretary Sally McManus saying any minimum wage increase below the inflation rate is a wage cut. I'm joined now in the studio by the Employment Minister, Stuart. Minister, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Well, Anthony Albanese says Labor supports a rise in the minimum wage case that ensures people's wages keep up with the cost of living. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it?
Well, Anthony Albanese came out and put a figure on it, Fran, 5.1%.
Because that's the rate of inflation.
But it's unheralded. There's not a single leader, either a Prime Minister or opposition leader, since the Fair Work Commission began, give or take 12 years ago, that has done that. And this is the problem.
Does it matter?
Well, he's got no economic plan, so he's making it up on the fly. Even Mr Shorten in the past has simply said he believes in fair and sustainable wage increases. Let's leave the Fair Work Commission to do their job.
Yeah, but is it a fair statement from a government, any government of the day, to say to the Fair Work Commission that the government of the day believes workers' wages should keep up with the cost of living, workers' wages should not go backwards?
Treasury and my department's job is to provide all the economic indicators, any data the Fair Work Commission may need, trend data, analysis of wages, and analysis of payments to allow the independent umpire, in this case the Fair Work Commission, to do their job, as they've been doing year on year.
But as Sally McManus said there, isn't the maths of it that any wage rise below the rate of inflation, which is 5.1%, is effectively a wage cut?
That's why we have an independent Fair Work Commission, so they can independently make a decision, in the same way the Independent Reserve Bank does that on cash rates. Everyone should do their job, Fran. The independent agencies should do theirs. Those holding fiscal policy, the government, should do ours.
As Sally McManus also pointed out, the government's 100-page submission to the Fair Work Commission actually has a whole chapter on the importance of low-paid work. I've had a read of it. The argument goes that low-paid jobs are a stepping stone to better jobs, so you have to be careful, because if people are paid a slightly better low salary, then they might be doing themselves out of a job in the future. But is it a better way of thinking of it that more money in more people's pockets is better for the bottom line of all the small businesses out there?
Well, submissions from government come through Treasury, informed by my department as to all the economic indicators, to allow the Fair Work Commission to make a decision. This has been the way it's been done for multiple governments. If I go back to what Mr Shorten said, in submissions that he's put forward, he believes in fair and sustainable. His language was considered and
so
sound.
what's the government statement? What's the government saying it believes in?
Well, the government believes in an independent Fair Work Commission. That's the whole point of doing it. We don't have independent commissions for the government to try and run roughshod one way or the other.
But it also believes that low-paid work is an important stepping stone. Is that a hint to the Commission that you've got to keep wages low?
No, not at all. The job of government is not to provide a hint or guidance. It's to provide facts. It's to provide data, to let them do their job.
Do you see any danger in Anthony Albanese's pitch, where he said today, under questioning from reporters, that absolutely Labor will support an increase in the minimum wage equal to the rate of inflation, 5.1%? Do you see that as a problem in terms of an increased pressure on inflation?
The issue is that it's unprecedented in terms of a leader not acknowledging the Fair Work Commission's independence, coming forward with a view. What if inflation's higher? What if it's lower? Does he increase what he'd like to see? Does he decrease? Does he have any idea of the impact of inflation? Has he sought advice and thought it through? Does he know what the impact and the flow on to other areas of work is?
There was not a number. If the opposition, if the government, a Labor government in the future, said we just want to make sure that the minimum wage keeps up with the cost of living, would you have a problem with that?
But Mr Albanese didn't say that.
Well, he did say that, and then he went further and said it should be 5.1%.
Correct, in an unprecedented way.
But in their submission, if they say should keep up with the cost of living, OK?
But let's go back to Mr Albanese. He's either had an unprecedented interference in how wages are set, or it's another typical Mr Albanese gaffe. It's one of the two, both equally dangerous, because both go to the fact, unfortunately, Fran, they have no plan, so they're making it up as they go along.
On another issue, Scott Morrison was asked today about Catherine Deves, the Liberal candidate for Warringah, who now insists that describing gender reassignment surgery as mutilation was the correct terminology. The Prime Minister went on to say that gender reversal surgery for young adolescents, and I'm quoting, is a significant issue that parents are concerned about. Minister, in this country, gender reassignment surgery is not available to young adolescents. It's only available to people over the age of 18. Is the Prime Minister misleading people here? Is this an issue?
There's no question it's an issue, and my understanding is there's been some court judgments that would allow it under 18, but I'm happy to be correct. It is a sensitive topic, and we should...
The stated words in the Health Department's rules and regulations around this is that, as a general rule, reassignment surgery not available to anyone under the age of 18.
And I'll defer to the Chief Medical Officer, because I'm certainly not the Health Minister, and I'll make that very clear. It's a sensitive topic. We should treat it sensitively. The words that are being used are not words I would have chosen, and the Prime Minister's made the point they're not words he's chosen. These are difficult issues.
Words you approve of? Do you disapprove of those words?
They're not words I would choose. I would choose to express this and try and season my words with lots of grace, because these are hard. These are difficult issues. Now, there are...
So was the Prime Minister wrong then to suggest or imply that at the moment young adolescents are allowed to have this surgery, which is, of course, irreversible?
I'll let the Prime Minister's words stand as they are, without judgment. But it's a sensitive issue, and we should all treat it sensitively. And words matter. We all know that. And we're trying to have a conversation, or a conversation's trying to be had. My encouragement to everyone is have it sensitively. Seek first to understand before being understood. Seek first to understand the positions that Australians find themselves in. And let your words be seasoned with a bit of grace.
OK, well, and let your words be accurate too, I think would be important. Minister, you're not the Health Minister, you are the Education Minister, the acting Education Minister. The shadow Education Minister, Tanya Plibersek, wants to debate the Education Minister during this campaign. Alan Tudge, who's not the Education Minister but will be if there's a Morrison government formed, he said today that as acting Education Minister you're the appropriate person to conduct a debate. Will you accept Tanya Plibersek's invitation?
Well, I would be the appropriate person. It's probably a bit late in the game now, coming into week 4 for that sort of conversation.
She just issued the invitation again today.
Well, I'm sure she has, and I'm waiting for the Labor Party to determine who their shadow defence minister will be, or who their defence minister will be.
That's not an issue for you. You're the Education Minister. Will you accept an invitation to debate?
It's a bit late in the game for that, Fran.
8, 9, 10 days left?
We are. Voting has started yesterday. It is Tuesday.
All the better, isn't it, to give voters the chance to assess policies on both sides?
The next leaders' debate is on Wednesday, and of course the last leaders' debate is the final debate.
So that's a no?
Well, unfortunately, Ms Plibersek has left it a little late in the game for this conversation.
Well, I don't think this is the first invitation for a debate.
Well, it's the first that's being put to me in this respect, as you've put it, so it's late in the game.
All right, Minister, thank you very much for joining us.
Great to talk to you.
Okay, so we're left with a pretty fundamental difference between the government and the opposition, aren't we, on wages? A circular argument almost. Stuart Robert arguing that it's the independence of the Commission that needs to be respected in this process, whereas Anthony Albanese's obviously wandered into a space where he is backing 5.1% as an appropriate wage rise. Now, on the matter of independence, with a T, not independence, not all independents who have a solid shot of winning a seat are necessarily of the teal variety or running strongly on issues of climate and integrity. Rob Priestley is a business operator and Shepparton local, contesting the seat of Nicholls in Victoria. It's a three-way race there between the Liberals, the Nationals and Rob Priestley. Well, they're the most prominent of campaigners anyway. He's testing the nerves of a few in the Libs and the Nats. We spoke to him a short time ago. Well, Rob Priestley, you've sprung to national attention, and this against a candidature in which you kind of complained about Nicholls being one of the safest seats in the country. Now that you are getting some national prominence, what is it that what would be your number one requirement if you succeeded and made it into the federal parliament? What's the most pressing issue of concern there?
In this part of the world, water policy is really important, but ultimately I'm looking for a fair share of services and infrastructure for our community. Unfortunately, regional communities lag behind on a whole range of indicators, and there's been a certain amount of neglect, I think, stemming from the fact that we're such a safe seat. So I'm looking for that competition to bring a little bit more love and affection for our part of the world.
Is that predicated then on the notion of a hung parliament and you being potentially a really influential player in that? Because if it weren't, I wonder why they'd even be listening to an independent MP.
I think we can see that independents still have an impact regardless of the hung parliament scenario. There's three possible outcomes for this seat. The possibility of a slight Lib majority, a hung parliament or a Labor majority. And the way I look at it, in any of those scenarios, we're not worse off, and there's a real chance we can be better off. As a very safe seat, our member trots off to Canberra and often doesn't get listened to by the party room, and as a result, our voice is silent. So I think you're going to have someone speaking and advocating for our community.
And on the water front, just to flesh that out a little for those who aren't familiar with your part of the world, what specifically are you demanding there?
Sure. So this part of the world has lost $500 million a year in economic activity under the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. So we're coming to the conclusion of the plan in June 2024, and it's really important that quite vulnerable communities in this part of the world are looked after. We don't want to see more on-farm buybacks. We want to see sensible and practical measures. We've learned a lot since the start of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. We want to make sure that we look at all of that science, roll it in together, rather than sticking to some hard targets on a piece of paper developed nearly a decade ago.
And that's a position that I think is almost universal among the lead candidates there, isn't it? I think at least the Nationals candidate shares exactly that platform.
That's right. Look, we've got Lib, Nat and myself saying the same thing. The only difference is I'm going to be able to act on it. My fellow candidates, unfortunately, are going to be bound by parties who are dominated by numbers in other geographies. We've got the Nats being dominated by northern New South Wales and southern Queensland, and their interests are not the same as ours. And for the Libs, it's South Australian seats that are going to dominate them on water policy. I want to be the voice for Northern Victoria.
And you're being upfront that you would actually be using this as a bargaining chip, if necessary, again, under the hung parliament scenario.
Water policy is a live or die one for this community.
OK. Now, you're also proposing some ideas that go beyond local electorate concerns, I think, towards rural health or regional health across the nation. What is this proposal that you're putting for a minimum standard of healthcare in rural Australia?
Yeah, sure. So we're looking for minimum standards of healthcare. What we sometimes see, we've heard about greenwashing. I think we have health washing, where governments make an announcement, but it's not going to make a meaningful difference to outcomes. In this community, there are towns now of quite decent size that no longer have access to a GP. You've got people having to travel 40 minutes to the next town, maybe wait 6 weeks for access to a GP. They're real concerns in this area, and we have a lot of our established GPs retiring in the next period, so we've got a major issue with a pipeline supply of healthcare professionals as well. So regional Australians deserve a minimum standard of healthcare, and this policy is all about making sure that we are measuring where we're at, and then we can work towards improving it rather than making an announcement that may result in no real change.
And do you have any concept of the cost impost that might sit behind this, and who in fact would wear that? Would it be a federal government or those who primarily run the health system, which of course is the Victorian government in your case?
Look, I think the data exists. It's just about publishing it and making it available and then holding the government to account. So the costs will be negligible, and then we're going to have policy driven by outcomes rather than this idea of making an announcement and giving the perception of action without actually doing anything.
All right, so your campaign generally has a bit of momentum up as we enter the last 2 weeks. What about on the funding front? We have made a point of questioning all independents who've come on the program. Where are you up to with that, and from whom have you accepted donations?
Sure. So all the funding for the campaign has come from companies or individuals or businesses that have a meaningful relationship with the federal seat of Nicholls. So they might live here or work here or own a farm here or that type of thing. We've rejected funding offers from a variety of people and organisations because I want to be clear with the people of Nicholls that my motivations are all about this community, and I don't want them being worried about, is he really for us or is he for something else? I am absolutely committed to this community.
Yeah, so on Climate 200, Rob Priestley, I think they were one that you turned away. Why? What strings do you think might have been attached if you had entered a partnership with them, taken money from them?
Look, it's not about strings attached. I just want to make sure that people in this community can feel really confident about what my motivations are, and to be sure that my goal is to do the best I can for this community. And there will always be that element of doubt if the money's coming from someone outside of this region. So I think it makes it nice and easy for people to have a look and say, yes, this guy's all about this part of the world.
Yep, and just finally, Rob Priestley, to, I suppose, wrap up where we began. In the event, in the scenario of a hung parliament, minority government, what sort of criteria would you apply? I mean, I'm pretty certain you're not going to say specifically who you would back, but most seats, most votes, what sort of considerations would go into any decision you made?
Sure, we're going to see who's going to get the most seats. We're also going to see who's going to put forward what policy positions in that tight environment and what I can negotiate on behalf of my community. And we've already talked about water policy being one of those issues. And then ultimately, I'm also going to need to take into account the nature of the electorate. So it is a Conservative electorate, but I'm not going to write a blank cheque for the Conservative side of politics. I'm going to do what's best for my community.
Seems to be the position of all independents. Rob Priestley, thanks for joining us on Afternoon Briefing. Good luck with the rest of the campaign.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, we've had lots of policy debates on this program on the key issues of the election campaign. What about some of the issues not being highlighted by the major parties? I think it's fair to say that Indigenous policy has not been a focus, although Labor has promised a referendum in its first term of office, enshrining an Indigenous voice to Parliament. I'm joined now by Professor Megan Davis, co-chair of the Uluru Dialogue, and Pat Turner, Chief Executive of the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation. Megan Davis, Pat Turner, thank you both of you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask each of you in turn. Pat, I'll start with you. Is there enough attention being paid in this election campaign to Indigenous issues?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think it's a disgrace that the major parties have not given sufficient attention to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues. There are many needs that remain unmet, and we launched a report today to show that the gap in health funding for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is $4.4 billion. And that adds to our trove of evidence that we will use to continue to argue with governments how they can make up that $4.4 billion shortfall.
OK, I'll come back to that in a moment. But Megan, let me ask you as an opener, do you think there's enough attention being paid to Indigenous issues in this election campaign? Is there any attention being paid?
Well, I think there's some attention being paid because, of course, there is some commitments to the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and a referendum. But by and large, I agree with Pat. There's not enough, in my view, forensic kind of scrutiny of Indigenous affairs policy, and it's surprising given just how many issues it does traverse and how many problematic issues there are in the space. So while it's true there is a very key policy from the Labor Party to implement the Uluru Statement and have a referendum on a voice, and the Greens do talk about Indigenous issues, there really isn't in general any, in my view, appropriate focus on something that is one of the biggest human rights issues that face this nation.
And why do you think this is? Because, as you say, we all know there are inequities, we all know there are issues, and that was writ large during the pandemic and the rollout of vaccinations, for instance. Why do you think it is that political parties aren't focusing more? Do you think it is because they don't think Australians care? Pat?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I think that they think that Australians don't care, but I think it's promising that well over 2/3 of Australia support a voice to Parliament, not to government, as the Morrison government has proposed under Ken Wyatt's arrangements. So, that's promising. That shows us that other Australians are engaged, but I don't think that governments are anywhere near what they should be in terms of fixing a long-held wrong against First Nations peoples.
But, Megan, if governments thought it was, or political parties thought it was a vote winner, they'd be talking about it, wouldn't they?
No, not necessarily. I think Pat's right. I think Australians are engaged in this issue. They're also, as Pat said, they're very much engaged in the voice to Parliament, and we can see the polling over 5 years to that end. I don't think Fran media really scrutinises as much as they probably should some of the answers and the policies that do come from government in particular when it comes to Indigenous policy. There's kind of acceptance that what they say goes or what they say is fact. But if you reflect on something like the ANAO audit report in relation to Bridget McKenzie, well, Ken Wyatt's ministry has had the same kind of the Australian National Audit Office reports into the administration of the Indigenous Advancement Strategy. And in that case, you saw pretty serious misuse of Commonwealth guidelines when handling such large amounts of billions of dollars of taxpayer money insofar as Indigenous affairs. And very little attention has been paid to that and things like that. And so I think there are some really serious problems right across the Commonwealth settings when it comes to Indigenous affairs, and it just does not get the scrutiny that it should.
Okay, well, let's go to, I mean, as you mentioned, Anthony Albanese, opposition leader, has said that Labor will prioritise a referendum of a constitutional recognition in his first term. The Prime Minister, on the other hand, Megan Davis, has ruled out holding a referendum on the voice. He said, quote, "Why would I? It's not our policy." If he happens to be listening, Megan Davis, why should he? Why should he hold a referendum?
Look, I think one of the most important things I think to keep in mind is actually there's been a lot of activity in the past 4 years of his government around the Uluru Statement, the referendum proposals, and this co-design process, right? So the co-design process came out of the Lisa Dodson inquiry, a parliamentary inquiry. And they decided two things. One, they said there was no other viable form of recognition on the table, right? So there is no other proposal to go to the Australian people. But they said to put this to the people, you needed to put meat on the bones of the design, and that's the co-design process. And in addition to that, they put aside, $160 million in the contingency reserve to run a referendum. Morrison had said at the last election and after the election that he would look to talk to Aboriginal leaders in the Australian community about what form the voice would be in once he got that co-design report, and that conversation hasn't been had. So, I mean, I think my response to him is, look, for over 11 years, so this is a decade-long project in Australia, we have had bipartisan support for constitutional recognition. They came to the table with us and asked us to be on the expert panel. We did that work under the Gillard government, then we did it under all the subsequent prime ministers. And it was the Uluru Statement from the Heart where you finally, the Commonwealth retrofit at the end of the process what it is that Indigenous communities or First Nations communities might like. And that was the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and the idea of a more enhanced participation of our communities in the democratic life of the Australian state. And so that is where we are. That is the reform on the table. Just because, so Fran, I would say to you, he might have said that, but look, Turnbull said no back in 2017. Look where we are. Each year we're closer and closer, and we're building a movement of the Australian people. So we understand the limitations of Australian retail politics, but we also understand how important it is to engage the agency of the Australian people to help us, as they did in 1967.
Okay. So I want to come back to it because you're launching a campaign around this. I want to talk more about that. But, Pat, John Howard used to talk about practical reconciliation and symbolic reconciliation. He always favoured the practical over the symbolic. If constitutional recognition is more on the symbolic side, closing the gap, I suppose, is more on the practical side. And as you mentioned, your organisation has released a report today highlighting the gap in health funding for Indigenous Australians. The Equity Economics report says an extra $4.4 billion is needed to ensure Indigenous Australians receive the same level of healthcare as non-Indigenous. But per capita, Indigenous Australians are already receiving more, aren't they?
Well, yes, but the need is far outweighs the resources that we have to prevent the serious illnesses that our people carry. So when you've got, Australian youth, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth, 55 times more likely to die of rheumatic heart disease than other Australians, that's a serious problem. Our people are 3.7 times more likely to have kidney disease and 3.3 times more likely to have diabetes, and the list goes on and on and on. So what we need is to have equity in funding to at least meet those outstanding needs, Fran. It's not doing anything else apart from meet the needs. So if we've got 2.03 times the burden of disease, we should have at least twice the funding that's provided to other Australians to meet the needs that currently exist.
And Pat, it's a difficult question to quantify, but do you see the connection between the constitutional recognition and some of the health indicators? I'm talking about youth suicide rates, for instance. Do you think there's a connection?
The suicide rates, for our youth, it's 3.2 times that.
It's a shocking figure.
Yeah, they're shocking figures, and we deal with this every day. So I believe that there is a correlation. If we have a voice to Parliament, not a voice to government, then our people will be able to articulate that very forcefully to the Parliament and hopefully get greater structural reform. Now, we are pressing for that already under the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, where we have the 4 priority reforms, and that is about equal shared decision-making between governments and our representatives, not the representatives of just the Coalition of Peaks, but all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders in any matters that impact on our lives, and the building and strengthening of Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to deliver our own services to our own people, because we do a better job and we employ more of our people, and we have the trust and the cultural respect. The third one is priority reform is transforming mainstream government agencies like the police, hospitals, juvenile detention centres, out-of-home care, all of those things, so that they are more culturally respectful and culturally safe for our people. So you can see there's a hell of a lot of reform that the states and the Commonwealth have to do in that regard. And then the last one, of course, is the sharing of information and data. So we too can make informed decisions about programs and policies that impact our people.
All right. Megan Davis, along this, as you mentioned, Indigenous leaders are going to launch a public awareness campaign to try and drive support for Indigenous voice to Parliament being enshrined in the Constitution. It's 5 years since you and others came up with the Uluru Statement of the Heart. The Voice to Parliament proposal emerged from that statement. 5 years, and we still need this campaign now. Why is it taking so long for it to sort of catch hold, do you think?
I think law reform takes that long. I mean, it's the Constitution, so obviously it's one of the most important document in the Federation. So, you know, it took 10 years to get to 67. But it isn't just 5 years, right? The voice, the idea of the democratic voice came out of the rejection of both parties to the non-discrimination clause in the Australian Constitution in 2012. So there's a trajectory here in terms of engagement with the Australian community about what might be acceptable or not acceptable. What we know is that a lot of that is dictated by politicians who are, or have been up until Labor's commitment, afraid of the Australian people and referendums. But it takes this long. It takes this long to do something so significant. And so here we are 5 years after Uluru, staring down the anniversary a week after the election. And we have, one party saying that they will take the nation to a referendum and seek to empower our people through a voice to Parliament. And I think that's significant because of all of the things that Pat has just referred to. It's very difficult to get any traction in this nation on really significant policy pieces because our voice is just drowned out. But a formal process through the Parliament, one that compels the Parliament to listen to what we're saying, means it's a game changer in terms of Indigenous policy.
Yeah, it would be a significant change, but, you know, politicians are right to understand that it's very hard to get constitutional change through a referendum. You know that too. If a referendum to change the Constitution for an Indigenous voice to Parliament were held now, Megan, do you think it'd get up? And if not, what would need to change to get that support? Is it just political support would need to change?
So it's kind of quite a fair, straightforward change and allows people to have a voice. So it's actually polled at yes for 5 years, right? So the polling would say it will get up. What we do know, though, is Canberra likes to talk a lot about what happened 40 years ago, right? So what we know is that all of the experts, the electoral experts, the people that study referendums are saying that any data from before 1999 is dead old data, right? Because you've never had a referendum in this day and age with social media. And therefore we shouldn't be fenced in by what we think Australians will or won't vote. What we know is that this referendum is going to happen in a period in which the trust and faith of the Australian people in our political and public institutions is at the lowest in terms of history. The last successful referendum was when it was at the highest.
Yes.
So, some speculate, that you could have a referendum where maybe like 4-year terms where the political class will put it up, but the Australian people will vote it down even if it has bipartisan support. So my point really is we don't know. We're in uncharted territory. But the Constitution was meant to change. We know we have citizenship problems. We know we have the Republic to come. We know we have multiple issues that need to be changed in the Constitution, and this is the first cab off the rank. But Australians do need to get used to the fact that we're going to have to run referendums to get the nation used to it, because the text is meant to change with the nation, and the nation has changed.
All right, well, it's a living, breathing document. Let's see what happens at the Parliament, at the election. If there's a change of government, we may all be getting a chance to vote on it. If not, well, I guess your campaign goes on. Megan Davis, Pat Turner, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Fran.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Well, in his prime, Nick Xenophon was once a giant of the Senate, or to be fair, as close to one as a balance of power crossbencher can be in this country. He led a team of senators to Canberra from his home state before that ill-fated lunge at the South Australian state government. This election marks a comeback bid by him, this time as an independent, and we've not had an opportunity to check in with Nick Xenophon in his campaign so far, but we are today. Welcome back, Nick Xenophon. Why don't I start by asking what's the difference between being a humble independent candidate as against the good old days, the well-heeled campaigns of NXT and Centre Alliance?
I like to think I've always been humbled. I think I was humbled at the last state election campaign, though, even though we got 19. We absolutely were. Even though it was 19% of the vote on a fraction of the budget that Clive Palmer would dream about getting our sort of vote, which we did on a pretty low budget. But it didn't work out. 2 members of the Legislative Council were elected. A lot of good candidates came pretty close. So now I'm back. My name isn't above the line, but people can still vote for me above the line in box O. But it's very tough for an independent. I'm doing this not so much on a shoestring as on a dental floss budget. It is absolutely bare bones, very much grassroots, going around to polling booths, doing everything I can, using social media, which I haven't got my head wrapped around completely yet, but I'm doing my very best to get the message across. This is, I think I've said if I don't get there this time, there's always another election, so people can't write me off yet.
All right, this
is my passion. This is what I want to do. Well, no, it's a promise, actually.
All right. Why don't I take you back? We'll get through some.
Tough.
Okay, we'll get through some policy questions in a moment. I noticed when you left the Senate in 2017, you said, I've decided you can't fix South Australia's problems in Canberra, and you went on to say, without first fixing political problems back home. You didn't manage to do that back home. So how could you fix South Australia's problems from Canberra now?
Well, as an independent, if you're in a position where you may be able to hold the balance of power, but where you can advocate for the state in terms of the major issues. And let's look at some of the major issues. Water, the River Murray. Fortunately, there's water in the system at the moment, but the next drought, you never know how long away that is. And there are some real issues for wine and grape growers in South Australia that I've been visiting in recent days. So there's that. There's the issue of gambling, where I think states are hopelessly compromised when it comes to gambling. Just today, the ABC ran an investigative piece, $18 million in political donations from the gambling lobby to two political parties, and one political party, the Labor Party, appears to be the biggest beneficiary. So these are big issues. I want to do where I can serve South Australia the best, and in my view, that's now to work from the Senate. It's going to be tough to get that seat. A lot of goodwill out there, but there's some of the issues. Yeah. I know that trying to get across the line, trying to be in a balanced power situation in the lower house of the South Australian Parliament, that didn't work out. This to me is a pretty good way of doing good things for South Australia.
Sure. I know you were around at the time of the creation of the NDIS, the Disability Insurance Scheme. You've nominated as something you'd like to work on. In what way, though, does it strike you that more money is needed or just better management?
Well, it's a bit of both, but I think better management, and I think it's interesting that Andrew Charlton, one of Kevin Rudd's advisors, who's running for a Labor seat in Western Sydney, did make a point in a speech about a year ago saying that, look, there are issues about the structure of the NDIS in terms of its accountability, who it needs to report to, and I think Andrew Charlton's points were very well made. We need to have some systemic reforms, but the NDIS is a magnificent idea. It is something that must be allowed to fulfil its potential, and its potential for millions of Australians who need help so they can achieve their potential. So it's a question of the money being spent wisely. I mean, I also know of the frustration of many participants in the scheme, both providers but the recipients of help. They tell me horror stories about how difficult, how bureaucratic it is, how they have to go to the AAT, they have to wait a very long period of time in terms of getting some basic help. So there are some structural reforms that need to be done there for the NDIS to achieve its potential. But it's a big issue out there. If you're involved in the scheme, it can be very frustrating.
Yeah, and just a quick final one, Nick Xenophon, on the tax side, we're being told by both parties, apart from multinationals, there are no tax increases on the cards, yet we are carrying record debts and deficit. Does tax need to rise in this country, or would you want to see slowed the next round of personal income tax cuts?
It's how you spend it. And I'll give you one example in terms of defence. We need a strong defence force. We need to have that minimum 2% commitment of GDP for defence, given the geopolitical situation Australia now finds itself in. But we have a situation where the subs deal went awry, $5.5 billion down the drain, and goodness knows how many other billions of dollars will be maybe wasted if we don't get the project on track. The Taipan helicopters a few years ago, $3 billion. F-35 fighter jets, $3.5 billion. They're the sorts of things that we need to tackle head on in terms of making sure that we spend money wisely, and we also need to grow the pie. And that involves productivity, that involves looking at Australia's place in the world in terms of our level of economic complexity, which is hovering around Kazakhstan in terms of what we manufacture and how sophisticated our economy is.
All right, well, let's see whether they are conversations you will be involved in or not. You'll know the answer to that somewhere after the 21st of May. Nick Xenophon, thanks for your comeback on afternoon briefing on this occasion.
All the best. Thanks, Greg.
All right, so that's almost us for the day. Fran, yes, we thought it might be timely to check in with Nick Xenophon. You never can quite write that guy off. He's had a few lives.
You never can quite write him off. He's got a lot of energy, that's for sure, but it's a big mountain to climb, this one, I think.
Yeah, and wages. I guess we'll be watching in this space again tomorrow to see whether Anthony Albanese shifts his position there at all.
Well, all I can tell you is that as long as they're talking wages, I think Anthony Albanese would be happy, Greg.
Yeah, I reckon you're probably right. Why don't we wrap it up there then, Fran? Thanks to you, and join both of us again, same time tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.